welcome to the Working Differently in Extension podcast. I'm Bob Birch. Great to have you along for today's podcast, and good to have along our guest as well, Michael Martin. Michael is an associate professor of agriculture education at Colorado State University, and we're going to have a conversation about a commentary that he wrote for the Journal of Extension titled "The Polarization of Agriculture: The Evolving Context of Extension Work." I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation based on a really good commentary that Michael wrote for Joe, and you can find that at joe.org. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you.
So let's start with what prompted you to write this commentary. What led you to put this together?
Well, I'm fortunate enough here in Colorado to work with a lot of different, let's say, viewpoints surrounding agriculture. I always joke around with my students that there's the Boulder view, and then there's the view from the plains, which is a really simplistic way of saying it. But basically, we have a few different value sets here in agriculture, and they're fairly strong. They cannot be ignored. And so trying to value these value sets in what we do educationally has presented a lot of opportunities and challenges. And so what we've been doing in Colorado State is trying to, and specifically in our ag education program, to specialize in working through these different contexts. So this is sort of what's led me down to this field.
So you describe the different contexts of these agricultural values on a spectrum. Can you explain that a little bit? What's at each end of the spectrum?
Yeah, without getting too technical, one might easily think of it as conventional versus non-conventional. And conventional would be the larger scale commodity based production of agriculture, while the non-conventional you could think of maybe as organic or smaller scale, natural, CSAs. There's the problem with the end of the spectrums is there's actually a lot of different groups within. They're not singular entities. There's people who may prescribe to one end but don't agree exactly with everything that people who share the same spectrum agree with. So example might be people who believe in food justice. Well, that doesn't mean they necessarily always go shop at Whole Foods, right? Because these are two different concepts. So it's actually quite a few different identities on each end of the spectrum. The challenge for us in this field is not many people have taken a real critical look about these identities and also how these identities matter when we come to things like extension, education, and outreach, because how you format your message, how you work with your audience is very important, whether they're going to receive it or not. So it is a challenge. We try to really work hard to stay away from things like liberal versus conservative views. And don't get me wrong, those play a part. Those do matter. But in our initial discussions, we try to really, just say, hey, what do they value about ag? What do you value about ag? And where can we find a common ground for us to come together and have really positive discussions?
You mentioned coming together, and that was a question I had that about Extension's role in that. Does Extension have an obligation to sort of not just negotiate the minefield, but to bring people together?
I think Extension does. Yeah, it's an important topic. I think the challenge for Extension is the lack of resources they have to take on these, especially in urban areas. Many extension programs across the nation are understaffed as compared to the population that they serve, especially when you can, oftentimes compare it to rural areas. This is just a context that we have to work in, but it does create challenges in how to effectively serve the broad base of citizens in our country. I guess my stance is I'm employed by the state of Colorado, and it is my duty to serve the people of Colorado, and I don't necessarily get to choose who I serve because those are the people in there. And it also comes to the other point is that It'll vary from region of the country, and it'll even vary within the state you're at, what your clientele, who they are, and what they value. We oftentimes in ag literacy talk about people, let's say, for instance, where I grew up in the Midwest, our idea of what agriculture is, especially in rural areas, is vastly different than what we have here in the high plains and in the mountain regions. It's a nonstop learning curve for me. And that's just people within what we traditionally think of as agriculture, right? We're not even necessarily talking about people who have non-conventional attitudes and beliefs. So it is quite diverse, and you have to be fairly savvy on the ground to find ways to meet needs.
We talk about conventional and non-conventional agricultural views, and by the way, I think that's or agricultural values is how you put it in your commentary. I mean, to me, that's sort of a new concept. I don't think of myself as having agricultural values. Is that sort of representative of the general public, or?
Yeah, so this concept sort of comes out of what we think of as in multicultural education. Like for instance, you probably didn't know that you were, I'm going to assume you're Caucasian. You probably didn't know you were Caucasian until you met people who weren't Caucasian, and you realize that, wow, I have certain values as in my race and ethnicity that aren't necessarily shared by other people. Well, the same thing is true about agriculture. When you start thinking about these as just value sets, right? It's and many times we just haven't necessarily taken the time to get to know people with those value sets, and so that's sometimes my biggest struggle here at the university, and biggest struggle we face as a team is when we have students who are from the I-25 corridor. It's not that these students are anti-agriculture, and we could talk about that phrase. It's not that they dislike agriculture. I mean, last I checked, they like to eat. In fact, many of them are passionate about producing their own food. They come about the conversation in such a different way that many of our folks who are not from the I-25 corridor, it seems alien and it seems counter to their values. And so if there's not some honest dialogue and sometimes mediation, it can be taken the wrong way on both sides. So to me, values is something that we haven't done a very good job talking about in agriculture, because we've either been engaged sort of within our own circles, or if we are engaged with people who had different values, it's been in a negative context.
Yeah, I love the way that you explain that, because I think I won't. I don't want. I'll try and be a interviewer here and not provide testimony too much. But I can kind of see that from a land grant university standpoint, or an extension service standpoint, especially maybe in a state where the values are, if not monolithic, dominant, that you could the organization end up sort of adopting or supporting those values, just because it's the dominant, set.
Yeah. I mean, if I was going to get really theoretical, I'll just say one big word, and that's ideology. And ideology at its core is not bad. Everyone has a set of values that they believe in. If you live in a community, if you have, family, if you're in contact with people, you have values. And that's okay. That's healthy. In this discussion, we never advocate for people giving up their values. That just seems crazy. The difficulty is when you allow your own values to get in the way of other people being, happy and functional in society. And so that's the trick is, look, you have these beliefs in what agriculture should be. Fantastic. And you can advocate for that position. Great. But let's be sure to leave room for other people who don't necessarily have the same values to also function and to also advocate in the right way. Look, there's going to be conflicts, right? In fact, a healthy society has conflicts. We have a variety of important issues facing agriculture, which we should engage in difficult conversations. But that doesn't mean that we can't listen and grow with each other. And that's the trick. You need to honor who you are and respect who you are and what you believe, and also come together people who may share different values. I'll say one more thing. When we do a lot of these studies on our students, when it comes to culture, when it comes to talking to our students which identify themselves as being from agriculture, it is amazing to hear time in and time out that while they might necessarily understand their own race and their own ethnicity, they do understand their own value when it comes to agriculture. And that is quite astounding that they're that articulate and astute to understand where they come from and what they value, and to be able to say it in their own words in ways that many other students at their age cannot. So it's an amazing value. It's an amazing thing, an amazing value, but you can't necessarily just let it dominate.
Yeah, does that sort of indicate how closely agriculture values might be tied to identity in, with people who grew up in agriculture? I guess is my first question, kind of as a follow-up. Is there the same sort, if that's so, is there the same sort of feeling or awareness of agriculture values on the other side of the spectrum?
Yes. All right. So I'm going to start answering that question. And if I don't answer exactly how you like, you can feel free to ask it again, because it's a very complicated question. And there's, when you talk about these things, there's no such thing as facts or proof, right? You're just sort of working through some evidence for clues. And what we've seen so far is that if you're going to look at people who are from more of a conventional background, it's very much about family and tradition and community. Many of these concepts are wrapped around this. If you're to look at the non-conventional side, many of the arguments are wrapped around things like improving society, environmentalism, protecting Earth, and so it comes at it from a little bit of different direction. It's not to say that it's not to say you wouldn't find a non-conventional family who taught their kids, organic agriculture and how important it is to protect the environment. Look, that's also family tradition, but for the conventional kids, that tradition is part of the argument for why they're doing this. For the non-conventional people, that's not necessarily part of the scope of the argument. Now we can argue whether it's more important for people to be born into the value structure versus sort of learning and negotiating that value structure at an early age. That's intensity of the value is a difficult discussion to have, and sometimes can not necessarily lead to positive things, but occasionally you kind of have to frame it out, the intensity, because the intensity will come out in the discussions. Does that kind of get at what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think I'm just interested in the conversations, and it seems to me that maybe there might be a certain defensiveness, right?
Yeah, well,
Especially associated with maybe the conventional side because of that tie to identity.
right. So, especially for our conventional students, when they hear criticisms about agriculture, even now to the point of the corporate agricultural structure, which we could discuss, and I'd argue that this tie between the small scale family rural farm and the corporate agricultural entities is relatively new with vertical integration. But even when you throw in those criticisms, the conventional person feels like you're insulting them, that you are taking apart their values, when oftentimes I would argue the non-conventionalist is not, right? They have a different, they have issues, but not necessarily with everything, as well as the non-conventionalist. That's they are a little bit more adept at arguing their position because that's what they've come to grown into, right? It's for them, it's about the issues rather than a way of life. So they have, they don't necessarily take as much offense to it as more conventional people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to get to. I think that's really an interesting point, and again, part of sort of navigating all this. So, um, let's sort of make our way back to the extension challenge and role here. I was really interested in the commentary. You gave an example using National Ag Day, and you sort of outlined a little bit how you think each side, if you want to call them that, conventional versus non-conventional, do they view ag education differently?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is the agricultural education, as we know it, for the most part, is a very conventionally framed entity. Extension, high school ed, even what I do with ag literacy, is very tied to conventional roots, and that's fine. That's where it came from. The non-conventional side, they will use the term ag education occasionally, but oftentimes they use other phrases like food justice, maybe environmental education is the guise, community support agriculture. So when I talk to folks in non-conventional settings, and once they learn what I do, they're happy, like they're excited, they want to connect, but they didn't initially think of themselves as doing agricultural education.
So, going back to what you said about ag education sort of coming up out of conventional agriculture, um, do non-conventional the people who are in that non-conventional ag values group, um, do they automatically have some suspicion of any kind of ag education, extension included?
Yeah, so that depends on the area that you're in. The more entrenched a community is with the non-conventional views, the higher the probability for them to have suspicion towards, and I just say suspicion, towards agricultural education and extension education. I know some extension agents that work in these areas, and they do face that. Um, there's been publications of different varieties that talk about the way that extension has uh, dominated, right, or has been a force, a change force on the conventional side. That's probably a better way to say it, to be a change agent on the conventional side, and they'll point to different historical movements as their point. And by the way, I gave presentations to the general public, and I've had people stand up and call me a conventionalist, and I've had to answer for what I said in public, and that's fine. That's part of the dialogue. But yeah, there is for some a suspicion when it comes to messages from Extension, and on the school-based side, I've seen people protest, right, because they see the label of Monsanto on the high school side. So there is this difficult negotiated space there because of perception and because of history. And I'm not saying that the silver bullet is very easy, because you have to rebuild those relationships, right? And you have to be flexible enough in your programming to offer them something, right, that matters to them. And that's the difficult thing at every level, is what do you have to offer that matters to them and that they will find meaningful.
Uh, I wonder if have you seen over the years uh, conventional agriculture, those people with those views, um, has their view of how this dialogue is going to, quote unquote, be resolved changed? It just seems that in the last, 3 or 4 years, there's been more talk about we have to. This is the reality that this is always going to exist, and I don't know if that is a change from the past. Maybe in the past, did they think, eventually our viewpoints will win out?
Well, let's be honest. American society has in many ways become more entrenched, and it has in some ways become not entrenched. In agriculture, I think we see groups going in both directions. For instance, at Colorado State, I think that we've done a fairly good job of loosening up our students and hopefully our constituents in the state to these different viewpoints. But that's probably because we find ourselves in contact with each other more. I think this is just my hypothesis, but I think generally it seems true. The least amount of connections you have to people who are different to you, the more likely you are to entrench because you don't necessarily have people to connect with. I heard at the meetings I'm at, I hear the phrase uh, people against agriculture quite a few times. And I sometimes just want to go up and ask people, will say, who is against agriculture? Who is against eating? Who is against, clothing yourself? It's when we say people are against agriculture, there's actually a really bigger statement at play there, right? It's that people are against our values and are perceived as working against our values. And so, yeah, there's definitely people who are becoming probably more entrenched on these issues, and there are people who are opening up to these issues. And that's true of America as a whole, and it doesn't make our jobs any easier, but this is the reality of America that we're dealt with, and we have to do the best we can.
One of the things you mentioned in the commentary is just how extension uh, may have in the past viewed agriculture as a neutral subject. And of
Yeah.
course, part of the extension brand promise is this idea of objectivity. So I want to ask you about your thought that maybe extension professionals should be honest and share their agriculture values.
Yeah, so this is my philosophical viewpoint. I think many would agree that there's actually no such thing as objective. Meaning, when I walk into the classroom, I will be a white male from a Christian household, and I will be that until the day I die. And I may get older, right? So right now, I think I'm barely middle aged, hopefully barely middle aged. But so there's things about us that we cannot change. Now, I can go into a classroom and I can be objective as possible, but at the same time, I must realize that I bring this baggage forward. And that's just the key, is acknowledging and understanding what you bring forward and just being honest about it. So, it's sometimes a little bit of semantics, right? You can be objective as much as you can, right? And you can do a lot to get there. But we are never truly objective just because we live in a pluralistic society, right? And even as I said before, what I knew here in the Midwest, and let me tell you, politically, ideology wise, what I knew in the Midwest is different than what I know now in the mountains. Even that, not even but working in communities is vastly different. So that's just the key. As I always tell my students and people I work with out in the field, is just be upfront and honest, at least with yourself. You don't got to make a big deal about it with your, people that you work with. I don't walk into a room and say, you know, white Christian here. I don't, but in my mind, I may say to myself, okay, just because I grew up valuing things like competition doesn't mean that the people in this room value competition. In fact, competition may be the last thing that they're looking for. They're looking for community, unity, cooperation. So just those small things, but it's also, you have to know yourself. That's the hard part too. To know yourself and to be honest with yourself.
Well, one of the things you mentioned when you're talking about that in the commentary is just this idea of hidden agendas. And I wonder if that is something that that the non-conventional side is hyper aware or sensitive to, especially because of the sort of corporate association with the conventional side, and thinking, there's hidden agendas behind anything. And does an extension professional working in that kind of polarized environment, maybe coming into a meeting where they know that's going to be there, is it to their benefit to say, hey, this is who I am and where my values regarding agriculture come from?
I think it is important for anybody to keep that in the back of your mind. So it, this is the complicated thing about agendas and hidden agendas. Most people in our field don't have overt agendas, right? They're not in our field, right? There are people who work in advocacy. That's a different thing. But many times we do bring hidden agendas. which in itself on the isn't necessarily bad, because we do, like I said before, we have values, and we deep down want to see things succeed. Now, hopefully, it's a positive hidden agenda, right? We don't want to see people to suffer. You bring up a tough question, though, about how much do we lay out on the table? I think it depends on the audience and the situation, and you got to know it. I was given a presentation about GMOs at a local pizza place that hosts all these kinds of forums, and I knew going into it that that audience is going to be more non-conventional, right? And so I'm going to have to be ready to talk about these things, and so it is worthwhile to think about it. It's awful awkward though, just to come out and say, yeah, we've had this history of working with different, large corporations, or likewise, right, a history of working with, you know, non-conventional or even heavily liberal agricultural movement, right? It's weird to say that. Um, but I'll give you an example of how I do this in my classrooms. We just had a building built for agricultural education at Colorado State University, and in that building we house the Colorado Department Agriculture, Colorado Agriculture Hall of Fame, excuse me. And that building was built primarily with outside funds, a lot of with large corporate donors. And when we look at the Agriculture Hall of Fame, it has a lot of men, not many women, a lot of white men, though there are also some Japanese men. And so the opportunity for me when I bring people in, and it's appropriate, is to talk about that, right? Like, what does it mean? And it doesn't mean that, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're bad, right? It's just a reality, but it's an opportunity to have a discussion about it. And that's what we should try to treat these as, is when the opportunity is right, to have honest discussions about what these things mean for us in agriculture. And the difficult in all of this is to not point fingers and to not call somebody who is different than you, but I don't want to say names, right? But to call them out and to completely disagree. That's the tough part. And you just got to learn to go with the flow, and to also recognize look, there may be conversations which you cannot have. And you're so passionate about an issue that maybe, for instance, GMOs, right? Like if I was so anti-GMO that I cannot even fathom their existence, I probably shouldn't go into an open forum that's trying to increase dialogue. That would, and vice versa, right? If I'm so pro GMO. So just understanding that sometimes your internal values may be so strong that certain situations are not ideal for you.
I think you've addressed some of maybe what your answer to this next question will be, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because you ask a big question at the end of your commentary, about how do extension professionals work with this, all these differing values, without disrespecting those values, and still present unbiased information. What's your answer to that big question?
Yeah, it's tough, because what we struggle with here sometimes too is you don't want to create two separate systems, right? One for the I-25 corridor and one for everyone else. At the same time, you want to develop programs which address these various needs. And what we're finding is sometimes whole programs are based upon value sets which aren't compatible. This is the difficult part, that we're gonna either, if we're gonna truly serve our clientele, we're gonna have to develop programs and develop people who are skilled enough to adapt these things to the clientele, or to find programs and people that are like-minded, and so that adapting is less needed. We don't necessarily have the financial resources to create a whole new system. So we're going to have to find ways to adapt what we have to our various audiences. It is this question, by the way, isn't just facing extension educators in agriculture. It's facing many people involved in this profession, and probably generally speaking too, if you're doing any kind of educational programming at large, right, is also facing them. So I guess we could take solace in that, and it makes me smile knowing that we're not actually too unique, but it is a challenge that we will struggle with. My guess is we're going to struggle with for a long time, just as long as our society keeps finding itself in these different identities and we keep splintering and growing in different directions. It is going to be an issue to deal with.
Well, Michael, it's been a great conversation. Thank you for writing the commentary, and thanks for joining us for the podcast today.
Thank you.
Michael Martin is an associate professor of agriculture education at Colorado State University. His commentary is in the Journal of Extension. It's called The Polarization of Agriculture, the Evolving Context of Extension Work. You can find it at joe.org. Thanks for joining us for the Working Differently in Extension podcast. It's been great having you along. Hit us up on Twitter. It's at WDNEXT. You can find the recordings on SoundCloud, soundcloud.com/working differently, and show notes at bobbirch.com. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time.